Welcome to the third in a series of samro digital conversations to celebrate 60 years of supporting music creators. It's Heritage Month, so we're going to dive into how our heritage shapes our musical choices and how music impacts heritage. Now, I know Billy's got a few things to say about heritage, and we'll get into that a little bit later. I am really privileged to be with three extraordinary music creators today. The first is Concord Ngabinde. He is a creative artist, bass guitarist, composer, producer, music educator, and record label owner. I might have missed a few things out, but we'll get to that. Billy Monama, composer, arranger, band leader, guitarist, and founder of Grassroots Project. And then last, of course, but not least, not by a long shot, all the way from the mother city, we have Nomfundo Daluva joining us. Nomfundo is an award-winning jazz vocalist and musical educator. So we're going to talk today about what has influenced you in your life in terms of your musical choices. Let's start with you, Concord. Who spoke to you when you were growing up and changed the way you think about music and do music?
Thanks, Kirsten. Good to be here. Yeah, just the topic of influence and heritage can take us days.
Yes.
But my immediate response takes me to my dad and the music that he listened to. And just a few days ago, as I was thinking about this discussion today, I was thinking of all the music that he played a lot at home, and they varied from Princess Magogo's music to Mario Lanza, who was an Italian opera singer based in America. And my dad also had stories that went with these musics. And I remember when he spoke about Mario Lanza, for an example, that he had this powerful voice that he would be accompanied by a 60, 80-piece orchestra, and he didn't need any amplification. So he would sing above the orchestra. And there were stories of him singing in front of a window pane, and it would crack because of how powerful his voice was. So as a child, absorbing all this music, you're not just hearing the music, but also the music is encoded with stories, and those become quite a strong influence. And I think when today I try and write music, I try and make sure that it's not just about the music. There has to be something that propels the music. And with the story of heritage, I mean, we'll talk more about it, but I'm one of those people that are more open as to how I define heritage. And heritage being something that is passed on to us, you don't have a choice. And whether you embrace it or not, it still has been passed on to you. And how you engage with it then becomes the important thing that will define your own voice. And I mean, let's face it, we have been bombarded with material that is not part of who we are as a people. And for me, that journey of going back and forth between trying to trace what I could have been had I not experienced this bombardment and what society today think is our own heritage. That dilemma is out of which my music comes.
That's such an interesting piece that you've just mentioned, is how there are so many elements that have influenced you. And you started out with your dad's musical tastes. And then it goes back to your heritage and trying to establish what to take and what to leave behind. Is such an important part. Billy, who were your influences as you were growing up, and who still influences you today?
Morning, Kirsten.
Morning.
Thank you so much for the opportunity for me being around, my fellow musicians on this panel. My influences, as far as young as I am, they were very vast. I grew up, my neighbor playing a different repertoire because she hosted Stokvels every month month end, and my other neighbor Ndaba had a guitar, and that guitar will come out every special occasions like Good Fridays, whenever it's not working, Christmas, you know, and those special days. But then he will put it back on a wall like that. And I'm like, why is this guy taking back the guitar, you know? And, you know, the music will be playing from the gramophone. We used to call it Limboro. You know, it will be playing from the gramophone whole night. Remember in the township, you know, there's no curfew, that there's a cut-off time of music. So you are imposed to listen to that music, and he will play the repertoire of Mahona Tohle, you know, especially Western Kosi at that time, the Abdullah Ibrahim, then Temi Pileso, all those, the merrymakers. And my father died a long time ago, 1992. So, but when I was growing up then, there was a lot of LPs, you know, from the George Benson. They asked so much music that my mother every Sunday will pull out and play on the LP. He will play George Benson and the TP, the Commandos, Billy Ocean, you know, all that. But now, you know what is that? In the house, the repertoire, it was American. But when my neighbor play the music, it is South African music, you know. So I have all these influences around me. And then sometimes when there are weddings, like special occasions, when there are ceremonies, they will call those ladies, maybe it's all Gidinaka. You know, it's like a symphony of, you know, it's like a rhythmic drumming, you know, ladies and men dancing there, you know. So that also, you know, I will see it, but not quite as often. Then I will go to church. When I go to church, then I experience a different taste of music. You know, so now imagine what am I hearing at that point. I'm hearing George Benson at home, and then my neighbor, she's playing Western Kosi. That other neighbor also on the other side, he's playing a guitar, but he was playing a Nyaza music. Do you know there's a guitar player by the name of Nicholas Zikara? You know, those guys, they're from the Comatic Board side. So they're playing that guitar style. And then there was a man at church who was playing Mpaqanga. And then when I go to church, then I got to reference the music that I hear when my neighbor, she's hosting a Stokvel. And when I get to church, I'm like, oh, here's this guitar. Then that's when my love for the guitar started, because then I started imitating all the guitar melodies, guitar phrases. So that's where my influence, it was drawn. And, you know, when then later in the 90s, you know, things get developed, and then the Alan Kwela, they came through, and then they influenced me. People like the Cyril Magubane. Then I got to concentrate a lot into what is called jazz guitar. Then when I went to school, I realized there's something missing about this curriculum. Then I started then listening to a lot of African, especially South African guitar, you know, players, and then that's what influenced me. And also the geographical part of things also influenced me, because I was born in Mahwelereng. When I moved to Johannesburg, I stayed in Soweto, in Deep Kloof. And there, the geographical changed a lot of things, because people in Soweto, they have their own. So socially, I get influenced by, you know, what is happening socio-politically and socio-economically. Yeah.
Sounds like you had a very musical upbringing, surrounded by different sounds. Nomfundo, you unusually, from the age of 12, you studied classical piano. And I'm so interested to find out where that desire came from. And I mean, now you're a world-renowned jazz singer. And there are two very complicated or complex musical genres, as classical and then jazz, which goes from, I guess, being quite structured to being quite chaotic, if I can say that about jazz.
Ouch.
Ouch. No, in the nicest possible way, it's chaotic. Nomfundo, give us an idea of your influences as you were growing up.
Yeah, good morning to you and to the panelists, my good colleagues, Billy and Concord, and everyone who's tuning in. Yeah, for me it's interesting because you're quite correct. I started my entrance into music was through classical piano when I was 12. I was raised by my grandparents, both late now. And my grandfather, had this incredible collection of jazz records. And when he was not traveling for work, this is what was always playing at home, juxtapositioned, with my grandmother's, love of choral music. And so that's really but I don't think that at such a young age, I had an awareness. I don't think that I was necessarily paying attention to the music that was playing at home. It was just the music that was there. And so, my grandfather being, he was a law school dropout actually. And he just had this kind of really sophisticated ear and taste for music. And his whole thing was he wanted me to be able to play an instrument. And so when I then enrolled in what was then referred to as a Model C school, which was in, I was standard 3 at the time. I think it's like grade 5 now or something. And for the first time, I was going to a school that had extramural activities that included music lessons. One of the first things he insisted on was that I take piano lessons. And this emanated from, me having seen a piano for the first time at a friend's house for a play date. And I'd never, ever, seen one before. And I wrote about this actually in the Mail and Guardian a couple of months ago, my first encounter with the piano. And so true to form, when I then rolled into the school, I started classical piano. It was really only much later that I started to toy with the idea of jazz. And even so, it was because the likes of Abo Judith Sipuma, Abo Jimmy Dludlu, were coming out. There were music videos of these artists that were playing on television, and I thought, geez, I actually want to do that, Omusa Manzini and the likes and that whole sort of UCT cohort. And I thought, well, that's what I want to do. And that's how I kind of landed up choosing the University of Cape Town to study jazz, because I didn't want to study opera. But to say that I fell in love with jazz then would be completely incorrect. For me, jazz is something I fell in love with once I was already studying it. It was an acquired taste. And so it required for me to then go back and to listen to people. So, two women stand out in terms of my influences, especially in as far as South Africa is concerned, and it's Miriam Makeba and Swongile Kumar, right? And I mean, obviously I'm influenced by a whole lot more singers, but in terms of really finding my rooting, those two women, really stand out as the pillars of my influence.
Absolutely. It's lovely to have, especially two women standing out. We were talking earlier before we went on air about how important women are. Concord, you've worked with an unbelievable array of people, both internationally and local musicians. As a session musician, you've played with, I can't even begin to list the number of people. You can do some name dropping now if you'd like to. Tell us about how those experiences have shaped the way you do music, and vice versa. Have you had any influence on the people that you've played with? If you do a jamming session, have they? One assumes they've learned a bit from you because you know what you're doing.
You'd have to ask them. I guess it's been a privilege to be able to work for many years before you come out as an artist on your own, to work under certain people. For me, Johnny Clegg really stands out. And not so much for the music, but one, the concept.
Yes.
Just the importance of the strength of the concept of what you're doing. But two, understanding that it's not about the music. And as I was saying earlier, there are stories behind the music. And those stories are so important in terms of carrying the music through the years. Yeah. And you find that even people who may not really connect with the kind of music that you do, but they find themselves in the stories, and that leads them to the music itself. But thirdly is the business side of things. Just watching Johnny Clegg and how he worked with his management and the tours and putting out, marketing and publicity, all that. For me, it was so crucial to see that at that stage, so that when I stepped forward to say, now I'm ready to do my own projects, he actually was one of the people that really encouraged me to do that. So there's that one aspect, and I think often we don't talk about that kind of heritage, because for me, when I sit and create music, I don't try and copy or emulate that sound. I'd like that sound to influence me, but I'm more interested in creating a new thing that I would call me. So it's, for me, the heritage approach is quite a holistic thing, that at the end of the day, people hear the final product, which is the song, but we, the creators, know that there is so much that goes in behind it.
Well, your heart is completely in it. You give a little piece of yourself away every time you create a song, and it's your story coming through. And just a question: when you have created a song, when the final cut is done, what is that feeling? Do you sit back and listen and say, "I've told the story I wanted to tell. This is the story of me in this situation," or is that a...
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's a part of us as artists that seem not to ever get satisfied. Yes. And we want to continue tweaking this and that. But I think with old age, I've been waiting to say this for many years. With old age, you get to start accepting that this is where I was at that time. And you embrace that. The other thing with putting stuff out there that I've learned to accept and learn is that once you've told your story, you have no control as to how people will receive the story. There are cases where you write a story that comes from a happy place, and you really feel that you've expressed yourself and this is a happy song. And someone comes to you and says, "No, every time I listen to this song, I just feel so sad and I cry." And I used to question myself, that does it mean I have failed to communicate my story? And the answer is no. People experience what you put out based on where they come from and what they know. And sometimes maybe that song might sound like a song that his late father used to listen to a lot. So it triggers a different emotion. So once I've told my story, I put it out there and just let it assume its own life. And you have no control over that.
Well, as it is with all art, isn't it? It is in the eye of the beholder or the ear of the listener and the emotion attached to it. Billy, your lifetime passion, we now know, and you haven't reached the old age yet, so one assumes that this is going to carry on, is mapping the history and features of South African guitar playing. And you've dug deep, haven't you? Tell us a little bit about this. We heard before that your love of guitar playing came from all the music around you when you were growing up.
Yes, I think if I were to put this with what is called heritage, I first need to give a perspective of what is heritage and what is that heritage. I'm putting it in the inverted commas into the music, because often people, they say it's Heritage Day, they say that it's heritage music. I have so many thousands of questions on my mind. It is not heritage music. Heritage, it comes from heredity. It's something that you inherit. And I would rather say this is cultural music, because our culture, so now there's a thin line between culture, customs, and tradition. They are all saying the same thing, but heritage is saying the opposite. And what we say that is heritage, the practices are not the same. Heritage is like, for me, when I inherit my father's sinuses, it's something that runs in the genes that you can't really change. And now, with the culture, customs, tradition, all those things, they evolve. You know what I'm saying? So now, I think the question of heritage, it needs to be looked at. Rather, I would call this thing a cultural heritage. So now, it is the cultural of Nkabinde, because he's Ndebele, you know what I'm saying? And then there's another one, he's Zulu. Because the reason we have this so-called Heritage Day is because originally it was a day whereby a Zulu nation was commemorating Shaka Zulu for putting the nation together. Then in 1995 it was declared by as a national public holiday. But if we look at it in that deep sense, that are we really celebrating our heritage music because of who we born with? What are we born with? Because a lot has changed culturally. So now I come from different cultures. I had to just give that background so that you can understand. I come from playing pop music. The first music that I played was Mpaqanga. And the people like the Alan Kwela, the Wes Montgomery, the Jimmy, Cyril Magubane, they influenced me from the jazz point of view. Then I started playing jazz. And then, and then I played with hip hop artists. So now when I write music, all these elements that I have experienced culturally, they come out in the music without me trying to dig deep. I'm sure that many composers, when they write a song, no one plans a song that I want to write a sad song. It's a song that comes and then later you're just thinking of a title. What should I title this song? And like Ngavinde said, that when after you write the music, it's up to the listener, it's up to the consumer, how they receive it. No one plans to write a hit. No one says, no, I'm going to make a smash. So yeah, I'm sure that we all want to make a hit because of potential revenues. But I'm sure that if authentically, when we create music according to our cultural experiences, where we've been, geographically. I spent time in KwaZulu-Natal. I learned how to play maskanda because I spent some time with those people. I learned how to play umpaqanga. I learned how to play hip hop. All those elements, they come into the music.
So it really is, when we're talking about heritage, we'll move that word aside and talk about culture and speak about the fact that it's actually an evolution. It's an evolution of self, and it's an evolution of sound. Mfundo, what is your take on that evolution? I mean, you've evolved definitely and grown a lot in your musical choices and the way in which you do music and you teach it as well, which is an interesting thing I'd love you to chat about. What's your take on the cultural evolution of our heritage?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, I guess, and I think, it's one of those things that I think it's best left to people to interpret it, based or, on their own lived experiences. When you talk about culture, you're talking about a whole lot of different things. You talk about customs and traditions. And I suppose, in different spaces, people look at heritage through different lenses. And I think, in the context of South Africa, when we celebrate Heritage Day, I think it's really about, it's not exhaustive of what heritage represents. But I think in the spirit of celebrating the essence of who we are and the diversity of our cultures, then we put it under this umbrella of heritage. And I think under this umbrella of heritage, we can then house culture and customs and traditions, right? And so I think in terms of music, when you think about it artistically, it's really a question of, because I'm Xhosa, and so by virtue of being Xhosa, I've inherited that it runs in my blood and in my veins. And therefore, therefore, to me, that is my heritage. And how do I express that? I express that through my art, right? Through singing about, our customs and traditions and rituals as Xhosa people, right? I sing about my identity, my clan name, and my ancestors. And different cultures will celebrate that in different ways. And I do agree, of course, that it evolves, right? But there are certain things about culture and traditions that do remain stagnant, like that just are there and you can't move them. And then there are some of them that do evolve. And I think it's really a question of being open-minded. It's a question of, really kind of trying to find who you are, always going back, talking to people who are older than you, and just exploring and also not just about your own culture, but the culture of others, so that we can get to a space. And I think evolution is really about getting into a space where we learn more about other people than focusing on us. And therefore, I think that kind of also breaks down this wall of othering. I think what we're wanting to strive for is an interest and a curiosity about that which is different to us, And so I feel like, I need to make an effort to learn about, the Zulu culture, Ndebele culture, or what. And I think when we get to that point where we are intrigued and we're genuinely interested, in something slightly different to us, we'll be able to really reach a level of evolution that is absolutely magnificent, and that can be inherited, again, coming back to that word, by generations to follow.
I love what you're saying there, and the inclusivity then of music when you take all these different cultural influences and create a new thing. Concord and I were talking earlier about innovation in music, and that's a conversation we're going to have in November. But just that innovative sound. I mean, I know that South Africa has sent jazz out into the world in a very different way. Let's talk about the South African jazz that we've created.
Billy,
Yeah.
do you want to jump in?
Okay, cool. Well, nobody says that when she's Xhosa, she will do the traditional music because of what she is. But I know so many musicians who are, for example, who are Zulu, but they have nothing to do with Zulu music. You know what I'm saying? So that's where, for me, then I find this culture has kind of, the so-called cultural music, has differences in our influences. I think also it depends with the geographic point of view, because if you are Xhosa but you are based in Johannesburg, but you are not rooted, you don't have the traditions and customs of someone who is in Eastern Cape is a different Xhosa. So now, South African jazz. South African jazz, the influence of it to the globe, to also us here, it is regarded as the emancipation style of music, because if you listen to the Afro-pop of today and many music, it is drawn and structured from that South African jazz. I regard Maskanda as the music that was never influenced by American music. So now South African jazz is like, I call it a subdiary of American music, because you must remember the blues and ragtime swing influenced African jazz. So now in 1952, there was a man by Alfred Hubbard, who who invented what is called, he was a promoter, African jazz and variety. So now, at that period, it was in the 50s whereby, they were called, what do you call those things? It was a theatrical opera, jazz operas. So that jazz opera at that time, they had Miriam Makeba, the Dorothy Masuku, the Dolly Ratebe, all the stars, the Sonny Pillay, so different people from different cultures. Now, that was the melting point of South African jazz. But you must understand that geographically, what is important is that we need to understand that people in the Cape Town, they play jazz differently. People from KwaZulu-Natal, they play jazz differently. From Limpopo, they play jazz differently. But in South Africa, in Johannesburg, when the different cultures, they meet, they produce a different sound because of the different backgrounds of musicians. So then African jazz, it developed from what it was in the 1960s. But now in the 1960s also, it became one of the revolution because Miriam Makeba left South Africa to the States in 1959. And then the others, the Abdullah Ibrahim, the Blue Notes, they followed. They put the South African jazz into the international map. The youth, they followed her. And for sure, Miriam Makeba, she was one of the successful South African singer who has, put South African music onto a global stage.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, Miriam Makeba is hugely iconic. She's incredible. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, to what Billy was saying, my observation, our colonial influence has also meant that South African musicians have learned a lot of music from the UK, from the US, and from around the world, even Latin music, that when you take, and I've heard many people say this from overseas, that when you take a South African musician and you put them with a bunch of musicians from New York in a room, they will thrive because they can play swing, they can play Latin. But then there's also this other thing that they bring. So when you look at the current ones who are doing amazingly, the Nduduzo Makatinis and Skakane, and they don't just go to America to play American jazz. But they can play the changes, they can improvise with everybody. You call the keys, you call the extensions, they understand all that. And that has given South African musicians an edge when it comes to working with musicians overseas, whether in Sweden or anywhere. And I think that is something we should be proud of, in a sense. But I think it adds to the influence that South African jazz musicians have currently and before. I mean, when you look at the Begim Selegus, even earlier, the Eastern Cape musicians who went into exile, they already understood what those guys were playing in terms of the jazz language, but still they stood their ground and said, this is what we want to do. And that is an edge that we should continue to embrace, I think, as musicians today, and not lose that thing. And I can't put a name to it. I get excited when I see people, there are young people like Mabeleng Muhulu and Joe Makanza who are making what they call indigenous musical instruments, and they are placing them in the hands of little children. And those kids, you may not necessarily expect them to play only that sound, but they incorporate that sound even when they do their rap music, their amapiano and hip-hop. There has to be that thing that speaks to us, and if we give that to children at an early age, then it will come naturally out of them in whatever they create.
Well, this is what we're talking about today, is our musical heritage. And when we talk about African jazz, that's it. We've brought it.
Yes, and you must understand that, I mean, like, African jazz, it was in I say it was in 3 segments. So now there was African jazz of the acoustic era that was like the 1930s. And then there was African jazz of the jazz operas of the 1950s. There was African jazz of the black consciousness of the 1960s. And then now, today we have Afro jazz. We had like the Judy Sipuma. So now I'm sure that in the next coming years, like now we have the Berita, who are continuing with the Afro jazz. That is a generation after the Judith, you know what I'm saying? So now, this African jazz, it will keep on evolving. And you listen to the music of the African jazz that is, now they call it Afro Soul. Singers like the Berita, Amanda Black. It's more electronic than what it was from the Miriam. People like the scholars like the Nomfundo, the Titi Luzipos and all that thing are the people who will always be there to remain, to keep that tradition of the Miriam Makeba and the Tolira Tebe and so forth. But now things where they started for us to be diluted as black people it was the European curriculum, because in 1800 the schools they were set up in South Africa by the missionaries. Missionaries, when they set up the school, that was the starting point for us to lose who we are. For today, they bring back my child. They say that I must speak to the child in English, so that when he goes back to school, he must be fluent to speak to other kids. What are they trying to say? You know what I'm saying? So music is one weapon that we have, that it can hold keep the identity of who we are, because the missionaries, when they started this thing, they've taken, they diluted us, as black people, even the instrumentations, like. I will say that the first the musicians who were not influenced by European and the Americans, they are the ones who came before 1900. Post 1900, then there were guitars, there were keyboards. There were pianos, the costinas that today you can hear in Maskanda. That was left after the San Luana battle. So the Princess Magogo, they were influenced, all that, by all that instrumentations that they were left by the Boers there. So now we need to have consciousness when we talk about African jazz. And, where it comes from. I think we need to get it from that gist.
I'd love to hear from Nomfundo. You mentioned that she is a classical, like Miriam Makeba. This is, let's talk to you about your feelings around African jazz and what era or what phase, as Billy was saying, you find yourself most comfortable in, if at all?
For me, I've always adopted a standpoint that kind of, shies away from this discussion of jazz in as far as sort of where it comes from, what's diluted it, what's not diluted it. And kind of its history and what is and what isn't jazz, because I do generally deem it to be a somewhat futile conversation, right? Because jazz by its very nature is a democratic art form. So a lot of the time I just go, well, you interpret it as you will, because jazz affords us that freedom. But then again, the scholarly part of me understands and recognizes jazz as an African-American art form that emanated from the slave trade, and so there's an entire history there, and not, but also of West Africans and Cubans. And so it's a big pool of beginnings, right? And I think, and so there's that. And in that, there is a tradition and a technical tradition of of jazz as a traditional art form. And it's a hybrid of Africa and Europe and Western and kind of Eurocentric harmonic structures, infused with indigenous African rhythms and feels, right? But I think moving, not dwelling too much on that, I think for me, I straddle both worlds. And I think I now look at it and I think I have to acknowledge the training, the classical training and the Western European training or the Western classical training that I have, because it has shaped my artistry. And not in a way that antagonizes my Africanness, but in a way that gives me, a technical ability that I perhaps would not have been able to attain without it. And I'm not unique in that sense, because I think as we read about South African history and South African jazz, and we quote and we say these people's names who were incredible musicians of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there's so much about how they trained and how they studied their craft that's not documented. And you find that these bands of the 50s and 40s, whether it's vaudeville, whether it is the African jazz and variety, whether it's Sponon or all of them, that they were actually behind closed doors being trained and sort of mentored by Americans, right, and Europeans, because they did want that thing that they felt they didn't have access to. And so we have to dig deeper in the history. If we're going to read it, then we need to read it in its entirety and not kind of pick and choose that which we want to, to put to the fore. And also, in terms of South African jazz, it really has its roots predominantly in the Eastern Cape, in my opinion. Incredible musicians have come from parts of the country that are not cosmopolitan. And so when we define jazz and African jazz, we also have to keep an open mind in that sense. But perhaps as a closing sort of to that issue is the question of African jazz and South African jazz and its place in society. What we grapple with now is what is South African jazz's kind of role now? Because jazz and what was common between South Africans and Americans at the time was that they were fighting a common struggle of Black oppression, a common struggle of emancipation, and jazz was the tool, right? And so Black Americans and Black South Africans or Black Africans found a common tool and mechanism, by which they could fight, against oppression and marginalization. And that's where jazz comes from, in essence, in terms of its spirit. And I think now in 2021, when we play this music, the question is, what is our messaging, right? What is jazz's place in society now, right? One could easily say that it's still the same. It's still a music that we use, to fight certain battles, to find expression, to enjoy freedom, to seek, equality. But it's too vast. And so the more we open it up, and the more we kind of open our minds about it, then we are all a lot more at ease as practitioners, and if you're going to talk about the curriculum as well, people say, well, there's not enough, so that, the curriculums in universities are too Western and they don't recognize and they don't have. But if you think back, you go, well, what Black musician was going to teach jazz in 1950? Because where would they have gotten the education? The system did not allow for Black musicians to study. So there wasn't going to be anyone. So we have to now do the hard work and the slog of educating Black artists so that they are able to teach. Because just because you can play doesn't mean that you can teach. These are two separate skills, right? And so it's a tricky one, but I think we're moving in the right direction. But I think we need to read deeper, and we need to have a more kind of nuanced understanding of where South African jazz really comes from and what it is in society.
Yes, I want to add that,
Sure.
Because you see, if we can agree that in 1932, Eric Gallo, he changed the South African landscape. How am I saying this? When Eric Gallo invented Gallo Records, that's when then there was so much import of gramophones and also, you know, European and American records that our South African local musicians grew up then listening. If you read the book of Hugh Masekela, the Miriam Makeba, all those people, they were influenced by American music of that time. If there wasn't Ella, there wasn't going to be Miriam. But one thing that makes us different is that Miriam, she says that the reason, even when she was doing the jazz opera, jazz and variety, she says that she wanted to keep singing the songs that she learned from her grandmother, her African. She never wanted to lose identity. But other people like her peers at that time, the Dorothy, and the Dolly Raiteve, they were singing American music, actually American repertoire. You know, what made her to stand out is that she never wanted to imitate or wanted to sound like anyone else. That's why even when she got to the States, the international thing, he was mentored by Belafonte. And then Belafonte always encouraged her to sing in her mother tongue, to get like, that is why, she was who just because of that mother tongue and heritage that she never lost than her peers who were like jazz orientated, you know what I'm saying? So I do agree with Nomfundo about the musicians at that time. They couldn't teach music because they were deprived education. Remember, we were the black musicians at that time. They were the innovators of the music. So the African jazz, post-African jazz, then there was Kwela, there was Umpaqanga. Umpaqanga music, it is the fusion of the Kwela African jazz and that is what is a mix of sub-styles, and then it got electrified. You know what I'm saying? So people like they listen to Mawatela Queens and Mahlateni. They must understand that these people, they evolved with times. The musicians who were playing Kwela music at that time, when then African jazz came in, they're like, we're going to lose our money. Then they started playing saxophones. Then you find Ntemipileso, he was a penny whistle player, but then he joined, Banira Chabane, he was a penny whistle player. Then when African jazz was in style, they're like, let's go there and make some money quickly. And then when Mpaqanga came, those who were playing African jazz, Amajuba, they left there, they joined Mpaqanga because Mpaqanga then became the pop music of the 1970s. So we as the youth of South Africa, like Nomfundo, she's saying, we as the youth of South Africa, what the youth of 1976 they have started, it is not yet over. We need to continue with that. And it's all in our hands as the youth. The curriculum, the material is there. Nomfundo, she is researching, writing a thesis. Someone else, Duduzo, is researching about Begum Seleku. This other one is researching. All the institutions right now, they have the research dissertations. Why can't we combine those dissertations in one book and create a book that will be accessible to anyone who wants to know about South Africa?
Well, this really is what we're talking about, is our musical heritage and the stories that we tell, what Concord was saying, what we put out there, and the different messages, as you were saying, Nomfundo, what are we saying now with our music? And it's a beautiful evolution, isn't it? And that is our heritage, this ability to evolve, this ability to innovate, and this ability to tell stories. We're about to run out of time, so as always happens when we're having fun. So, closing comments. Concord.
Just following on what Nomfundo was saying around the education part of it. If we want to retain a heritage that is ours in what we create, we need to educate ourselves. And unfortunately, that education is still not readily available. I mean, you have to dig to find certain aspects of it. And I think that is our challenge as creatives, that we really need to dig a little deeper and find the piece of information that is available. Sometimes, as Nomfundo suggested, we need to engage with people who are older than us, but sometimes it's unfortunate that they already don't have much to offer in that regard, because they've also subscribed to the newer way of doing things. But whatever pieces of information that are available, people who are doing research and so on, we need to get into that. And as artists, we can't avoid that if we want to contribute meaningfully to this discourse.
I love that. And I know, Billy, you are about to release a book that is long awaited, all about guitars, and you've done a lot of research on that. Any closing comments that you have?
Well, yes, I'm not going to say much. I think I've said much about education, and I'm going to repeat that as a youth, we need to continue the struggle of the youth of 1976 where they left off. And the dissertations, all these researches, all this research work, I wish that the varsities, all these musical institutions, they can allow us, you know, to do some survey, go through that, and then put it in one material that is going to be accessed by anyone, whether you're from Venda, whether you're from, you know what I'm saying, it should not be a research that is owned by a certain institution. I want, if after I've done the research, Ngabinde says I'm doing a research about South African bass, it should not be owned only by VES. Someone who is interested should be able to access it without, working hard, extra mile. And, you know, older people are passing on. So we are on the clock. We need to work very fast. You know, we don't have that much time. I will give more depth in the upcoming book that is going to be published next month. So yes, so far I'm saying that we do have a potential to change the future as the youth of now.
Looking forward to the book, Billy. Nomfundo, closing comments from you.
So yeah, just to answer Billy on the accessibility. I mean, I did my Mary Makeba thesis sort of over 10 years ago, and it's readily available online. A lot of these dissertations, I was reading the other week, you know, Putisipuru's dissertation, they are actually available online. So if you Google it, you'll get access to it and you can read them. You know, the question really is about whether young people are making the effort to research and to read. Because the stuff is there and it is available. It's more journal articles that you have to go through paywalls, but dissertations, you know, you will find them readily. And I know this also just from having done my MBA dissertation last year, you know, that dissertations are available online. And then, you know, I think ultimately my thing, and I think also just in relation to samro, celebrating 60 years this year, I think if we wanted to really move a step closer to unleashing and to kind of deepening the pool of education about indigenous music, you know, we need greater access to the archives. And so when you speak about Gallo and you speak about samro and you speak about, you know, all the material that was recorded pre-democracy, both audio and visual, it's a lot of it is still owned and resides outside of African shores. And I think, you know, it's a question of this, sort of retrospective retribution, that we need access to those archives. I mean, how do we release them? How does Gallo and other record labels of pre-democracy, you know, return the ownership of this music that was composed by Black artists, but not properly credited? You know, how is it that we can get the footage that was recorded by these European, you know, production houses and anthropologists? How do we get that archive to be readily available and to make heritage and cultural material mainstream and easily and freely available so that we've got materials from which to teach? So it is there, but I don't think South Africans own their archive. And I think that's my parting shot in as far as how do we move forward. But thank you for having me part of this discussion.
Thank you all. That was an exceptionally brilliant parting shot. I love it. So hopefully we can explore that a little bit further. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Concord. Thank you, Billy. Thank you, Nomfundo. And join us next month. It's Transport Month, and we're going to discuss road tripping and those playlists that keep us moving. See you next month.